Trackmania works on a simple premise. You drive a fast car around a track as quickly as possible, fixating on the time and improving on each iteration till you reach your goal. The car handles incredibly well, and when you hit a corner just right, the feeling is impeccable. So how do you add to this formula? What kind of changes could feel like additions to the players without taking away from the fun? This is the story of how new cars got added to Trackmania. In Trackmania, the car had always remained the same, but the surface the car interacts with changes, or some external forces like booster or slippery wheels are added to the car. This allows for a huge variety of styles when playing the game, as different speeds on the surface also affect the driving. A great example of this is tight turns on tarmac with tech and fast precise lines with slides when driving at full speed. A very important aspect here is that transitioning between the surfaces is fun and adds interesting and varied tricks between transitions, like starting a drift without braking from grass to tarmac, or when exiting ice you can slide your wheels to level the car. These driving styles are completely different, but the controls when driving on these tracks feel similar enough that you can seamlessly transition between them. Well, somewhat seamlessly obviously. Player strengths are an aspect in every game, like I'm generally better on ice than I'm on grass. Another thing the keen-eyed observer might notice is that the tracks aren't really like real-life racetracks, they are much more blocky and cartoony, and that's by design. This is to allow for a great track editor anyone can use to create tracks into the game, and it is the lifeline of this game. Yes, the default maps made by the developers are alright, some of them better than others, but where the game really comes alive are the community created tracks. There's so much variety, thousands of maps for every skill level, every playstyle imaginable, even for the absolute lunatics. This is the core aspect of the game that keeps it fresh. It's really hard for the developers to carefully calculate each track, but when you have experienced, skilled players making and playtesting tracks together as a core part of the game, you get some of the most beautiful racing experiences possible. The driving isn't always similar to real life, but it's always internally consistent, and it's what any arcade racer tries to be. Basically spanning the last year, Trackmania introduced 3 new cars into the game as content drops, and they are all varying in quality. They also gave us a couple of new blocks to play with, and a new surface in wood, which had its own controversy. When I say new cars, they aren't exactly new. They are the first 3 cars from the original Trackmania game, and from what I've gathered, they remain relatively faithful to the originals. However, I have never played the original Trackmania, so I don't have any first-hand experience in this unfortunately. Let's look at the snow car first, as it is the first one to release. It has an incredibly high turning radius, and entering any sort of slide on this car will lose a lot of speed, so no sliding is the name of the game here. The speed loss is also increased on tighter turns, so taking somewhat shallow lines is the best practice with this car to keep speed. It doesn't have any that interesting special interactions with any platforms, just don't steer a lot on dirt or grass, or otherwise you find yourself sliding and losing all that hard gain speed. Guess how the snow car handles on ice? It doesn't. It literally does nothing. You can't steer this thing on ice. Normally on Trackmania, on ice you can kind of drift and slide in the turns, and using your brake and acceleration on ice is very important to keep good lines, and it's a really cool playstyle. But the snow car, which, I don't know, should be like the ice car, does nothing on ice, except on bobsleigh. On bobsleigh, which normally is about stabilizing your car on the curve of the road, of the ice road, the snow car is faster when you go upside down. Just look at this shit. This is somewhat silly, but it's still way better than what the snow car can do on normal ice, so I guess they get points for that. I just find it extremely funny that the snow car would suck so badly on ice. You had one job, Nadia. Next up is the rally car, and I hate this thing with a passion. They really murdered my rally boys. Alright, let's do a thought exercise here. When you think of rally cars, what kind of cars do you think of? Or what type of races? I picture in my head a fast dirt race where there's a lot of drifty corners and maybe a cool jump or two. Now guess how you play the rally car in Trackmania? You guessed it. Right, you basically turn like you would a Formula car. You brake into corners going absolutely dead straight, so you never enter anything close to a slide, because if you do, you lose all of your speed. So the first thing you do when you start playing with this car is to limit your steering to half and change your sensitivity if you play on a controller. It's not something the game tells you though, so you either hear it from somewhere or you're eternally doomed with an uncontrollable car. And it's kind of crazy how outside of its wheelhouse this car feels on dirt and grass, which I would have thought fit this car perfectly prior to release. Normally dirt and grass are kind of slidey, drifty surfaces, where getting fast lines involves a lot of clean sliding and maybe taking some bankings to get some momentum. But with the rally car you just brake into them and try and smooth steer every single time. It never changes, it's always the same. While normally no sliding would be a mechanic you would use sparingly, on low speeds no sliding is actually better on the stadium car, the default car. But on the rally car it's just always better, it makes no sense. The rally car, to its credit, has a couple of good points though. It hops nicely and bounces off obstacles quick, which could be used for some cool tricks and is tech used in some records at least. Our last contender is the desert car, and it's a really weird one. The car feels best when sort of tapped into corners, but I'm terrible at executing this. This car is definitely the best out of the bunch and has some very unique tricks, like wiggling it over penalty surfaces, cause it's easy to topple over on two wheels. It's really hard to describe this car. I definitely gave it the least time of day, cause at this point I had really gotten over the new cars and just decided to mostly ignore them. But for this video I really tried my best to learn them. The desert car you want to tap so you don't start sliding again, and there's actually some visual feedback to the player when you need to slow down to turn, or otherwise it just takes like a weird understeer slide that just slows you to a halt. The weirdest platform for this car is plastic, because it kinda grips on it. It feels really weird to drive but works surprisingly well from what I tried. Normally plastic is all about tapping fast and getting gears or not losing gears. Oh right, gears. The long and short of it is that all the cars are automatic, and for the new cars the gears don't matter. But for the default car you wanna have your tires straight when you gear up to speed up the process. It can also lose or gain speed depending on how and when you gear, because the gearing process itself takes a bit of time, so you don't wanna gear up and then gear back down immediately, that will lose your speed. So if there's like a turn coming you might wanna keep the same gear. This is irrelevant for the new cars though and doesn't come to play at all. So this is most likely a good thing, because learning new gear intervals on 3 new cars would be a daunting task to keep track of. Anyways, back to the desert car. It's quite an enjoyable car when self-contained, but again this car is just terrible on ice. You have to like hard turn it into a direction and slowly it goes that way, it's not fun at all. When thinking about these new cars, adding them separately as tools for the mappers to play around wouldn't be as problematic, but these were force-fed on the new official campaigns, and especially for the newer players who wouldn't know any better, there was no escape in sight. You can tell how much I like the campaigns of this era when I barely even played the maps, and mostly like seeing a new alt car made me immediately skip the track. The right place for these was their own campaigns, which they got, and then in the toolbox of the community to be used. Now let's look at them as mapping tools. Since they don't work like Mario Kart where you select a car, instead they are hard-built change blocks made into the maps, so the mappers can use these cars as they please. I'm not well versed in mapping, but I have brought on one of the most prominent map creators in the community, SB Ville, who hosts regular mapping streams on his Twitch and has released 2 very well received campaigns of his own. So let's listen to what he has to say about the new cars in mapping.
So I am SB Ville or Ville, and I'm known in the Trackmania scene as primarily a mapper. I've built for competitions, I've built my own campaigns, some big projects including Threat of Ariadne, which is probably the most famous one, and a few upcoming projects like Core, which is another like endurance map, hopefully with similar reception as the previous endurance map. For me personally, the desert car is the most interesting one because it allows for the most variety. I think when you usually build like a rally car map, unless you're building some like 800 speed wood stuff or whatever, because wood has a really good grip with the rally car, that kind of changes the gameplay. But if you're building just about anything else apart from ice, I suppose, you kind of just end up with the same like no slide simulator. Snow car is kind of similar. You're just trying to like, retain speed a lot by doing smooth turns, and that's about it. But the desert car actually has like a little bit more going on because you can do these kinds of two-wheel turns. You can do smooth steer turns. Plastic also changes the gameplay a little bit, and I think generally like the shapes of blocks become a little bit more interesting with desert car. We do also have like other applications of the other cars. I think like all of them can be interesting, but it really depends on the context. So we, for example, in the previous khaki season, we saw some snow car maps where you had to use turbos, and on snow car the turbo effect lasts for a long time and it's really strong. So you can do these like long sort of sideways the boosts with the snow car after taking a turbo. All of these three cars kind of pale in comparison to the diversity that the stadium car allows. Like, if I were to think about building like a 25 map campaign, which I've done, I did it in 2023 and I did it again last year, just a couple months ago. So if I build it with the stadium car, I can kind of start with like, okay, here's like a dirt map, here's a grass map, here's a tech map, here's a NASCAR map, here's a full speed map, all these kinds of things. You can do bobsleigh, you can do ice, and all of these are like fundamentally different styles with fundamentally different player bases. But when you go into like snow car, it's like, okay, well, you can't really do anything too enjoyable on grass or dirt. And on even on desert car, like there's not that much going on that you would be able to like expand it into like so many different styles as what Stadium Car allows. So out of all four cars, Stadium Car absolutely still my favorite as a mapper because you can just do so much more. I have found a liking to the Desert Car a little bit though, and I have built a little bit for it, and it's pretty fun. This part, there's a checkpoint. And there's a snow car gate, right? So this is like a hybrid map where part of the map is in Stadium Car, part of the map is in Snow Car. The main problem with all of this is that the steering changes, the turn rate changes between different cars. And this is why I've personally never built a map with these kinds of like mid-course car change gates. So if you go here and you go into this part here, and now there's the checkpoint. So you're going to set up for the next turn, and this happens. What you're having here is you have the stadium car, which requires you to set up really early for turns. You have to start steering pretty early, and then you can drift if you need to do a tighter turn. And that works really well within the stadium car sort of mechanics. But when you switch the car like this, what happens is that you kind of just get this like 3 times faster turn rate, and you just slam into the wall because you need to kind of know how to react to it because the cars behave so differently and because the turn rates are so like drastically different. You end up having this situation where you can't really like as a mapper build an intuitive map with car change gates. The difficulty really as a mapper is when using these car changes that it will always end up being an unintuitive map. It kind of just has to happen because you have 2 different cars during the same track. Like there's very few games that would ever have like 1-minute courses that have like 2 different vehicles that you need to switch between or such. I think usually the best alt car maps are just with one car specifically.
The biggest issue here is that even when trying to build a good map for these cars, going from car to car feels terrible, and I think it mostly comes down to the steering. The turning radius and the inputs of the players have to output are so vastly different when going into any corner with any different mix of cars, that going from one to another just feels extremely unnatural. As much as I hate the rally cars interpretation in this game, it is the easiest to hop in and out of, as it's so insanely different from anything else that it doesn't feel jarring, as you immediately know it's nothing like the other cars. These cars also have a different turning radius, so going to a corner has a different timing, and they just feel extremely separate. This is especially bad on keyboard, because you have to use so many different action keys to limit the steering. At this point, just putting the action keys as defaults would almost be the quick remedy to not make them feel as jarring. But honestly, I think this system needs a full rework. They just don't feel like cars that fit being cars or being cars in the game. I guess not being realistic isn't that bad, as the stadium car doesn't really behave like a real life Formula car. There are some similarities, like you wanna kinda break into a corner, but the stadium car wants to mostly drift the corner, while in real life you would use the braking to gain more grip on the corner. You can also do some stuff that isn't realistic at all, like braking in the air stops your aerial movement, and sliding at high speeds is always faster than driving straight. However, these are internally consistent game mechanics that are fun to play with. After all, it's a game, not a simulation. So what kind of changes would I make to the cars to make them feel better? Honestly, I'm not that sure. I would at least change the snow car and the desert car around, or maybe merge them together, while keeping the desert car's mechanics. I don't think the snow car is that interesting. And maybe take the bobsleigh mechanics from the snow car, because that is way better than what the desert car brings. It makes a lot more sense that the snow car would topple over rather than the desert car, because when you have a high center of gravity, usually in turning radius test, the cars topple over easier. And these high off-roaders are actually known for toppling over easily when steering quickly. Then there's the rally car. This shit needs to go. It needs to go sideways. And I think looking at Need for Speed gives us the perfect window into how it should work. In Need for Speed you can turn corners sideways, putting you to that rally mentality where you go to a drift and snap back on the road. There is also a precedent for this on ice maps in Trackmania, but they are even more extreme and slidey, and having a drifting experience where it's a bit more grippy and snappy would be a great different playstyle for maps. Also on ice, gearing is a big problem, where if you gear at the wrong time you will just lose all your grip and slide out, and this could be something that could be handled differently with the rally car drifting around corners. The skill on this could come from maybe the snapback angles, maybe the angle of the drift, and it could be quite easily achieved if they just tuned down the acceleration of the car and kept the speed that it keeps on slides. This could maybe add some problems, like you would slide on straights and whatever, but it would be way better than what it currently is. There's really so much they should be able to do with the rally car, and it pains my soul that it currently works how it does. Even with these changes to the car, or theoretical perfect changes to the cars, it would still most likely be annoying changing cars. It would pull you out of the experience, and I'm not sure how this could be addressed. It's basically an impossible job, and you'd have to make them really similar in feel, and even then I'm not sure this would succeed. There's still something I haven't really mentioned here, which is Wood and its release. And oh boy was it a release. See, I learned when I talked to Ville that there was already Wood in the game, that they were retroactively changed to the new Wood mechanics, which are much faster than the old ones.
It is sort of like a silly surface, but I think it's used pretty nicely too. It can be used for some like really tricky turns. Interestingly, it kind of like adds to the same problem that we already had, which is the turn rate issue, because wood has like kind of a ridiculous turn rate, and because you don't drift at higher speeds, you kind of like have this very fast sort of gameplay, and transitioning from wood to any other surface feels very weird before you get used to it. The way wood was added to the game is you first had these wood blocks, which, simple enough. What Nadia wanted to do is they wanted to also change another surface to wood, and it is the pillars. Because for Nadia, it was somehow inconceivable to have two different wood surfaces, and this already existed. These are like the small planks. Thousands of maps use wood. It still like existed as an old surface, but the physics were the same as tarmac. This is the new wood physics, yes. It goes on the penalty grass because at lower speeds, penalty grass actually has higher acceleration than wood. And you notice that the steering here is 40%. So you have to be like really careful. And this is where the madness becomes very apparent. So we can probably pretty quickly see how this wasn't a good idea.
It really didn't help that the CEO of Nado was actively fighting people on Twitter on the legitimacy of this release, and it really sucks that this update was just launched onto the game, ruining ongoing competitions, old grinded world records and such. Wood has somewhat found its place though as a surface now, and overall I think it's a good thing for the game. The release was just extremely rocky. This video might come off quite negative, but honestly Trackmania is an awesome game, and adding things to a live service game is an important aspect of game design. The new updates they've had are showing signs of moving away from the new cars, as the new campaign from the winter has 0 instances of car switching, and they've introduced a new game mode where you blindly grind maps, as normally you would be able to play against other people's ghost and try to steal the pro strats. In this weekly shorts format, you have to come up with the strats alone, and I think that's awesome. This game is incredibly hard to start, but with the free access you can try the first 10 maps of the campaign and play the weekly shorts, so I'm glad they removed the extra from the campaign to actually get you to the core of the gameplay. And honestly, credit where credit is due. For a live service game, €20 a year for a decent amount of content and access to multiple competitions and game modes with a decent chunk of free-to-play content as well is an extremely fair business model, and I applaud Ubisoft for that. If you wanna get into Trackmania yourself, I will try to link helpful tools and content creators below that could give you a head start. Thanks to Ville for coming on. I will link his Twitch down below. And also, if you're still here, make sure to like and subscribe.